what do people get out of games? Why are they important? Why do they occupy the station in some people's lives that they do? Why do they perpetuate as a hobby for some people and not for others? And like, what utility do they have?
Hi, this is Gary Snow from Daiku Games and the documentarian that created the Friendly Local Game Store. And part of the Friendly Local Game Store documentary included a lot of really, really good interviews, including one from Brandon Hearty, right here in Calgary, Alberta. And Brandon is a bit of a, let's say, a Renaissance man. He does everything from game kind of theory to art, and just a really fascinating person. And I had the privilege of interviewing him as part of the documentary. And one of the things that just really caught my attention was, as part of his Masters Thesis, he did a whole article about game theory, for lack of a better term, and the psychology behind game theory. And I really thought it was just fascinating. And one of those parts of his thesis talked about this rat utopia. And it's a really fascinating piece about how rats find their own community, and when they don't have a purpose, they've essentially die out. But I don't want to ruin it, but Brandon can do better justice to it. But it's a really fascinating topic about the importance of games in our culture, and I just really think that his views and opinions should be shared. So it's really fascinating, and it's all part of the documentary. However, there's so much that's ended up on the cutting room floor just because the interview itself is almost an hour long, and when you start editing, you really can't include it all. But I think it's really worthy of sharing, and it's part of the bonus features, and will be included as part of the Kickstarter. So if you're interested, there's other really good interviews that are on there that are not going to be included in the full documentary, but they will be as part of the bonus feature. So go to the link in the Kickstarter. I'm also going to link to Brandon's Masters Thesis so that you guys can actually read it for yourself, because I do find it fascinating for all you kind of game nerd geeks out there that really like to talk about mechanics and philosophy of games and why we play as humans, which is all kind of included as part of the documentary. I really encourage you to go check out those links, and without further ado, let's get on to the interview with Brandon. Let's just talk a little bit about, like, how long have you been playing role-playing games?
Sure.
What was your first introduction to role-playing games?
Yep. So my very first introduction to role-playing games was when I was probably, I want to say like 11 or 12, maybe even a little bit before that. I'd moved to a new town, and a friend of mine had a bunch of books, and that he had sort of just inherited from his brothers, and we scrambled through them trying to figure out what the rules meant, and learned how to play fantasy role-playing game, sort of kind of by ourselves. And it was kind of him and me and, you know, at any time 4 or 5 other guys that would rotate in and out. You know, we never really did big games. And I think over the course of, you know, my youth, like junior high school, we probably played thousands of hours of these games. And so, yeah.
And where did you guys play?
In the basement. Yeah, it was actually the ideal location, in my opinion, to learn. Besides the books, he had also inherited this folding table that was just like someone had bought 2 like folding table legs and then like drilled a piece of plywood to them. And so anyone who came into the basement could like scratch up and carve and draw on this table while we're sitting around playing. And then he had, like, you know, all his brothers and sisters had moved out. He was the youngest of 6. And so we had this whole half of the basement was just one big open room that had, I think, 2 sets of bunk beds and like two or 3 couches and like a Nintendo in the corner and like some weights or whatever, you know, stuff that gets exiled to the basement. And we hung out there and just, you know, in the cool, cold basement in the middle of summer and just played our hearts out.
So, you know, similar experience to me. Like, basically summer, it was not even, you didn't even have to say anything. It was just like I headed over to my friend Dave's place in the basement, and nobody cared because we were in the basement, and we had a makeshift chalkboard table that we drew out the maps and everything on.
Nice.
But it was just kind of very similar as far as you just played all summer long before, like, you were expected to have a job.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and just like anything else, like I feel like that whole idea of exiling things to the basement, the weights go down there, the old record player goes down there, send the kids down there with those old books, whatever, you know. And I feel like for most kids, At least for me growing up, it was either the basement or the garage. That's where you hung out, because that's the free space that you can kind of exploit for whatever you want.
And so when you think about those times and your first indoctrination into role-playing games, I guess, did you ever think that you'd be playing them as an adult, or did you?
Yeah, I mean, like, you never really think of it with that sort of foresight, right? That anything that I'm doing now, like, if you ask me, do you think I'll be doing it in 20 years? It's like, well, now I have some clear vision of what 20 years from now looks like. But when you're 12 years old, you don't know what 5 years from then looks like. And especially, like, we had just moved to a new town. The whole concept of, like, well, life can change so dramatically from one day to the next. You might be in a whole different place doing with different people, doing something completely different. And so I didn't think so. I think that you don't measure the impact that something has on your life until after you can look at it in retrospect.
And when you think about life lessons, perhaps, that you learned from that time, now as an adult, what do you think?
It's impossible for me to extract the life lessons that I learned from just engaging in that form of play with my friends. It's impossible for me to extract that from the other life lessons that I learned in that basement. Do you know what I mean? Because that wasn't the only thing we did down there. We'd play, we'd talk, we'd do other things. And we had so many just impactful developmental moments where you learn how to talk confidently to someone else. You learn how to synthesize information and create an idea and then project it in a way that makes sense to somebody else. And, you know, you learn how to be emotional in front of your friends, whether you're playing or whether you're just down there talking about life, or talking about girls, or talking about TV, you know? So that's a hard question for me because, you know, that was where I spent most of my youth. And how do you pinpoint, oh, this is when I learned that life lesson? It's like the sum total of all the things that you get out of an activity is wrapped in the context in which you engage in that activity. And so, yeah, that's hard to say. If I had to take a crack at it, it was pretty clear to me really early just how much I personally gained just in terms of being able to communicate effectively. Because I wasn't like a super shy kid, but I was a small kid. I was like shy to some extent, and I had problems like talking to people that I wasn't super familiar with. If I kind of knew who they were already, it was easy enough. But when I was young, then it was hard for me to like talk to people because I would just have anxiety about it. And tabletop role playing works the way that it does because you as the player, or if you're the game master, I guess either way you're playing, you have to think about something that you want to happen in the game, and like imagine and project ideas and kind of run through different scenarios in your mind quickly enough to make a decision about what to do, and then you have to communicate to the other players of the game, this is what I want to do, and this is how I want to do it, or whatever. And I think that being forced to think that way, or a better way to say that is, because I was given the opportunity to practice thinking that way through the game, I think I overcame that really quickly. And I think it served me really well, both in terms of when I get back to playing and just in my normal life, like just being able to sit down and have a conversation with somebody. So,
did you tend to be the DM, GM?
No, I was terrified of that level of involvement because it takes so much knowledge. You have to know. If you don't know the rules inside out, you had better know the books inside out so that you can find the rules like on a quick turnaround. And that was always really hard for me because, you know, when I say my buddy inherited some books, I mean like he had stacks of books that all related to one role-playing system. And I just could not understand how he had this sort of pseudo-encyclopedic access to where everything was or what the rules were. I know now that there's some of the information that he sort of just fudged because once I started DMing and GMing, then you learn that like sometimes you just sort of have to, it's more important to just get through the moment than to disrupt it by having to look stuff up. And it disrupts the immersion if you have to do that too much. And that's why it's important to know stuff, but it's also why it's important to be able to think on the fly quickly enough to say, well, just roll a d20 and let's see what you get. And I was always terrified of that growing up. And I think that sort of de facto fell to the responsibility of the friend that owned the books. His name was Hugh. He's still a friend that I play with all the time. Not as much in person because he lives in Saskatchewan, but we play regularly. And so that was him. And then I had another buddy whose name was Corey. And between the two of them, they ran just about every game I played up until my 20s. And from that point forward, that's when things sort of shifted. And that's when I sort of developed the confidence, I guess. I think I had the knowledge base earlier, but I had to develop the confidence to be able to sit down and say, this is what the world looks like. This is what's happening around you. What do you want to do? And it definitely takes some warming up to get there. I think for most players, but I really admire the people that get in and learn a system and then just decide after a week or two that they're like, okay, I think I'm ready. Let's try it. And the bravery that it takes to just kind of like know that it's not going to be perfect and then see what happens.
And so let's now skip forward to your university years.
Yeah.
And maybe lead us up to where you actually did your thesis, and talk about your education and then how it culminated in that.
Sure, yeah. I did an education in the arts. So I feel like it's so different than any other degree that you might get because of the pressure that it puts on you to sort of find your identity or to dig up what your identity is. That you have to be really consciously aware of kind of everything that you're creating and making and doing in a way that, like, if I was doing a math degree, maybe that's not so important. You could argue maybe if I was doing a philosophy degree, you might do the same sort of like overthinking about who you are and where you came from and what you do. But for art, it's like, okay, well, you're going to make some art. What's it going to look like? Why is it going to look like what you just decided it's going to look like? Where is that coming from? What life experiences impacted you that's what you're making art about? And, just like anybody else going through my undergraduate degree, like I didn't know who I was, at least to the extent that they were my advisors were looking for answers. Who do you think you are? You know what I mean? And so it's like, I don't feel like I'm a color field painter. I don't feel like I'm like an abstract expressionist. What's important to me more than anything else is the people in my life. Like that's always been hands down true. And so I was always really interested in portraiture and like learning to paint people, learning to draw people. And building up even just towards my degree, that was something that I had to think about and learn and practice a lot because, if you're going to sit down and do something creative, you're not just going to do it because you just love creativity so much. You're going to do it because what you're making has some level of importance to you just out of the gate. And so for me, it was always people. And I was always doing portraits of people that I knew. It wasn't like sit down and find like a stranger on a bus and then draw them like a marble statue. It was like doing pictures of people and places that I liked. And so kind of moving forward through my undergraduate degree, that was sort of when the seeds sort of started to get planted about like what kind of art defined me as an artist, which is like this whole aspect of my life. And ultimately, where that started was I did these, like a whole series of these black and white images of people gathered in rooms. And it always sort of had an element of storytelling to the picture. That there's, if you're doing something that's in any way realistic as an artist, I think that there's some idea that there's a narrative there. That if you can extract, even from a simple portrait, if you can extract enough about like the earrings somebody's wearing or the type of clothes they're wearing, then you can know something about that person or that character in that picture. And so the same is true if you have a group of people. What knowledge can you extract? What story can you extract or narrative can you pull out of a picture of a bunch of people in a room? And so in the work that I was doing in my undergrad and that followed, it was always kind of narrative based in that like I wanted the viewer to be able to kind of notice these different moments that said something about the interaction or the relationship between these people in these paintings. And so some of them revolved around like explicitly around gaming, like specifically like playing role-playing games. And some of them were just reading a book. Some of them were sitting around in a group just telling stories. And I just always thought that was, I guess it was part of what I felt gave my life meaning and joy, was those moments where everyone's together and we're engaged, like we're talking to each other, we're feeling things out, and we're like sharing things and expressing emotion that, like, whether it's telling a story of something that happened or coming up with a new story and pretending something together. It's kind of all the same activity in my mind, that you're using your minds to just fuse together into one weird moment of excitement and energy and fun. So that's kind of what happened for my undergrad. And then coming forward into my master's, it was that same kind of sensibility of trying to define who you are as an artist, but on steroids. Because at that point, you're expected to be a professional already. You should already have a body of work. You should already be able to sort of like talk about your art or particular series of your art as like, one thing that embodies an idea or a group of ideas that are all related to each other. And then from there, it's like, okay, well, that's what you've done. Is that still who you are now? And what are you going to do next? And is it going to be more of the same, or are you going to innovate and change and do something else? And there's sort of a pressure to innovate further because they want to see that you can change and adapt and grow through new ideas. And so a huge part of any master's studies is reading more than anything else. And so even though I was in an art degree, I found that I was reading constantly. So it was like books and articles and magazines. And I hadn't really keyed into like the idea that I was a nerd. Do you know what I mean? That like I am, and I always have been, but like I never like constructed my identity around it. It never was just like the total summation of who I was. And looking back, I can see that other people probably cataloged me that way in their minds, right? But it's like, going to high school and stuff, it's like, that's all you know about somebody. Oh, those are those kids that play D&D in the library. They're nerds. And so that was me. But it's like, they don't know anything else about me besides that. So of course they think I'm a nerd, but I also know that I do X, Y, Z. And so I had never really thought of the idea that was a major component of my identity until people asked me to construct what my identity was for them. Well, Brandon, what are you then? And so it's like, well, I guess maybe I am a bit of a nerd. Okay, sure. Because you can't have as many video games and role-playing games and board games and, I've got a backgammon board in the corner. Like, no, like why? Unless you're a nerd, right? So it's like, okay, cool. So I kind of came to ownership of that at the end, sort of at the tail end of my undergraduate degree and then towards the beginning of my master's studies. And so in my master's studies, I was like, well, if that's who I am, I want to explore more about what that means. And then I did this deep dive into like, what do people get out of games? Why are they important? Why do they occupy the station in some people's lives that they do? Why do they perpetuate as a hobby for some people and not for others? And like, what utility do they have? And I think part of that just came from a background of, if, as a kid, if you spend any significant amount of time with any one activity, adults will challenge you on whether or not it's a good use of your time. It's a waste of time. Why don't you go do this? It's like, just stop wasting time with that. Go and learn how to build a house, and that's good. That's all fine. But I always felt kind of intrinsically that there was some worth to games that wasn't explicitly stated. You never pick up a board game or a role-playing game and look on the back cover and it says, guaranteed to improve math functionality by 28%. Like guaranteed to like improve your social standing in the situation that you live in. Like how would you deliver on a guarantee like that? But the more I went through my master's studies, the more I sort of came across this cool sociological research that came out of the 70s and 80s that basically said exactly that. That was like, well, with tabletop role-playing games specifically, and more than any other type of game, there's a whole wealth of skills that you can learn and practice while you're in the game that you take with you when you're finished, and that you can then just use in your real life. And I thought that was really interesting because, we've already sort of talked about, there's the idea that I speak more confidently than I think I would if I hadn't had that same exposure to the types of games that I played. Or even just the way that I think, how quickly or slowly sometimes I can put together an idea in my mind and say it out loud. I'll say right now, the reason I talk and talk and talk and talk is because I grew up playing games where that's what you did. You talk and talk and talk and talk. And so right now. I'm in a place where if somebody asks me a question about something that I'm really interested in or invested in, man, I will go on and on and on, because as a storyteller, if that's what you've practiced doing your whole life, then that's what you know how to do. And so that became like a big part of my master's studies, was kind of looking into that window of what utility games can have or do have, and what that can mean for, kids and adults, right?
I was very interested in the Rat Utopia because, and I'll let you do the background on it.
Sure.
And it kind of explain, but what I'm curious about is in today, how it relates to today's society versus the Rat Utopia, and what the function of a role-playing game provides that is similar to the Rat Utopia.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going all the way back to like the 1960s, where a guy named John B. Calhoun did some research for the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States. So it's a United States organization, and he's got some funding to do some research into human sociology. And he's interested in, what enriches our lives, what gives us like a good quality, like a good standard of living, quality of life. These are the types of things that he's thinking about. But what he's specifically thinking about is that in regards to sociology, how we engage with each other, and how we're in our interconnectedness as human beings and brothers and sisters and a family of humans on planet Earth, how that's sort of necessary to like a stable society, really. And so what he did was he took a bunch of rats, and he did this experiment multiple times. So there's actually a few different iterations of it. And there's not write-ups that I've been able to find on every iteration of it. But we know that he did it multiple times. We know that he did it with rats, and we know that he also did it at least once with mice. And he would make a big boxed-in space. And inside that space, he would put everything that a rat needs for a comfortable life in infinite quantities. And so infinite water, infinite food, infinite like nesting material. Those were kind of the three main ones, but like basically anything that they want. So he doesn't just dump it all in at once. He dumps in as much as they want, and then once they start to use it, then they just kind of refill the kind of stations. So there's always infinitely free, accessible resources for these rats to use. And then he dumped in, 6 or 8 or 10 pairs of rodents. And basically all he was tracking, the whole experiment was just tracking population growth, and then like they would make notes about behaviors. So if there's any like significant behavioral changes, then that was kind of important to track too. So what you'd expect from that sort of environment, or what I would expect going into reading about those experiments, was if you were going to draw a graph of what the population looked like, then you'd think, well, it's probably going to go up exponentially. They've got infinite food, they've got infinite nesting material, they got nothing else to do. They're going to do what rats do, and that's going to be breed. But acknowledging that there's the only finite limitation on their resources is space, then you could probably expect the amount of breeding to kind of taper off at a certain point. So it would shoot up really quickly, and then it would sort of kind of find a plateau and probably just more or less stay there, because it sounds pretty sustainable, right? Got all the resources you need except for space. So once you've got the maximum kind of ideal number of rodents in that space, then it's going to just kind of stay there. Well, what happened instead was the population shot off just the way that you'd expect it to, and then it began to deteriorate and decline really quickly, to the extent that within just a few generations of the peak population, the entire population went extinct. Literally, there were no live rodents left in the space. So, of course, John B. Calhoun's sitting there going, well, why would that be? And I think any of us sitting here would be like, yeah, why is that? Turns out, rodents have like a really simplistic society. And in that society, there are roles or like just positions to fill. And so when the initial rats were dropped into the space, they would, there'd be the tough rat, and there'd be like the sexy rat, and there'd be, I don't know what kind of rats there are, but there'd be these rats. There'd jock rat and goth rat, I don't know. And so once those roles were sort of filled, though, when new rats were born into the space, there wasn't anywhere for them to go of significance. There wasn't anything for them to do, no role for them to enact, nothing to give their existence function or purpose. And so void of that purpose, they would just sit around and not do anything. And, you can only do that for so many generations before your sort of genetic memory and instinct to do the things like fill positions starts to go away. So what happened was the initial rats that were put in there would die, and then the new rats that didn't have any practice filling those positions would be like, well, I don't know how to do that, so I'm not gonna. And then they just kept sitting around and they would die too. And then 2 or 3 generations later, you have rats that don't know how to do the things at all. They've never even seen it done that a rat would live this way or do this thing. And so it was really interesting. They stopped fighting. They would stop like wrestling with each other and fighting each other. They would stop, eventually they stopped breeding entirely. And what I thought was interesting about it was they'd sit around endlessly cleaning themselves. So they'd preen and preen and preen and preen. And then, but for what? They weren't even preening to attract a mate. They were just preening because that was the only part of their genetic memory or their instinct that was left in terms of like dictating their behavior. It's the only thing they knew how to do was just make themselves as beautiful as possible for nobody, which is super weird. And then of course, if they stop breeding, then they don't have new rats, and then the population dies out completely. And so they repeated this experiment like a number of times. And I think going through the literature, it seems like there was maybe at least a couple of times where there was some problematic things that happened where like maybe the rat enclosure wasn't cleaned out often enough in one of them, or like other things. So I don't think that it's a complete and total summary of like what human civilization can and should be, because the experiment might not be perfect or the execution of it might not be perfect. But people saw that experiment and they heard about it and read about it and totally ran with it. Because in the breakdown for the experiment, sort of what John B. Calhoun concluded at was that essentially, we need space, we need things to do to give our lives meaning, just like rats do. And as soon as we run out of space to explore and new things to find, then humanity is going to basically just do the same thing. And it's funny to note that he said that with a degree of optimism, because the first step to finding a solution to a problem is identifying the problem. And that's what he felt like he was doing. So he finished his research, or that stage of his research, and he was really excited. He's like, this is something that we know about rat behavior for sure, that we can probably apply to human behavior and brace for it and figure out a way around it. Because we are going to run out of space. We got a lot of it compared to a little 8x8 rat enclosure, but finite space, finite resources. And so he started to think about that in that direction. But meanwhile, the public is going this whole other direction. And there was all kinds of like weird graffiti that popped up that was related to his work, and people that wrote weird doomsday comics and stuff that were related to his work. And just people that were really like fixated on this idea that like, oh, humanity is going to implode. Human society is going to totally implode because we're going to run out of space. We're going to run out of things to explore and things to do. And significantly in one of it was a Q&A, I think, after the write-up to one of his experiments. One of the professors basically just asked him, or one of the people evaluating his work just asked him, like, if that's what he thinks humanity was geared towards. And he's like, well, humanity is a little bit different than rats in one significant way, which is our ability to create our own conceptual space. That once we run out of physical space to explore, there's still all kinds of other avenues of knowledge for us to think about and problems to work through. So whether it's music or math or art or science, there's a million things that we can explore in the conceptual sense without having to have like a new continent to go to. And he says that's going to be the saving grace of humanity, is our ability to just explore the innermost recesses of our own minds, our own imaginations, whether it's with something really utilitarian like a scientific evaluation of some other part of the world, or like some genus of butterfly in South Africa, or whether it's our ability to create new conceptual space to explore, like that's in the abstract, like music or art, or in this case, right now we're talking about games. And so I think that that's something that I fixated on really quickly, that his research, besides the fact that it's super interesting, has a direct relation to the idea that games have something to offer us as people, something that can serve a psychological utility.
And so putting that into the game context of, so what do games provide humans in theory, if you compare it to the rat utopia, specifically role-playing games, of like how are they able to enact, and then I can't help but draw conclusions, you tell me if I'm wrong on this, but nerds that are in basements that might not have the fulfillment of being the jock or playing one of those roles out in real world, and I can't help but draw the conclusion of those rats that are able to fulfill those fantasies of what they would like to be and learn those skills without
having the direct experience, lived experience, right? Yeah, well, that's exactly it, right? Is that, they say that smart people learn from experiences. Wise people can learn from the experiences of others. And then we're taking that a step further and we're saying, well, gamers can learn from experiences that they've synthesized themselves. You create your own scenario, you play through the scenario, try to enact and think out like what it is you would do in that scenario. And you can learn just through this sort of thought experimentation. And so, I think that the benefit of any game that brings people together is that it provides a really approachable, understandable context for a social interaction. And to the extent that, like they say that for people that fall somewhere on the autism spectrum, that that you can sort of bridge that gap a little bit by introducing them to a game that gives them some kind of social interaction with somebody. So, let's say you're like a really severely autistic, but you really like chess. Well, now here's an interaction that you can have with somebody because you understand the rules of engagement. And extrapolating that even further, the more complex the game in terms of interchange of ideas, the more rewarding the social interaction becomes. So if we're talking about role-playing games specifically, there's a whole bunch of research, most notably conducted by a guy named Gary Allen Fine, sort of a decade after John B. Calhoun would have been kicking around, where he wanted to look at, well, what is the impact just mentally on people that play role-playing games, on a regular basis. And this was springing out of what's referred to now as the Satanic Panic. So back in the, especially in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of Christian groups or like parent groups and things that got on board with this idea that games that related to magic or fantasy were somehow related to the occult, and that they were being used by supernatural forces to indoctrinate and corrupt the youth of America and Canada and everywhere else. And so just, growing up when I grew up, I was too young to like be kicking around the gaming world at the height of that Satanic Panic. But I remember when I was like, grade 4, grade 5, I had like some magic cards that somebody had, like my friend's older brother had given me, and they're all commons, like useless cards. And my mom made me get rid of them because she had heard and was worried that like, oh, is this like tarot cards? Is it somehow like corrupting my son? And she made me get rid of them. And I remember being like, Mom, that's stupid. It's a game. And she didn't get it, and she didn't have an access point as a parent to understand anything more than what they were saying on the news or in like, what was that terrible Tom Hanks movie?
Mazes and Monsters.
Yeah, Mazes and Monsters. I remember when I first started playing role-playing games, she was very cautious, but was not willing to she didn't want to kick me. She was like, she saw that I was getting something out of it with my friends, and she was like, well, don't not do it, but be aware of the risks. And so she made me sit down and watch Mazes and Monsters. And then at the end of the movie, like, it was such a serious thing. We had this talk about like, if you ever get to a point where you can no longer discern between reality and fiction, that's when it's time to call it. And I said, fair enough. That sounds good to me. I can agree to that. I was only like 12 years old at that point, but I was happy to agree to that, and she let me continue playing with my friends. And eventually I bought back into Magic too, and I played that throughout junior high school as well. And she warmed up to that once she understood more about it. But at the time, it was a brand new game type. And so you couldn't relate it to Monopoly or anything else that she was familiar with, right? So, yeah, so I forget where the question was, but ask it again if you need to, because I don't think I answered whatever you asked.
Well, I mean, I think you answered it, but it's such an interesting subject, like why, there's so many different angles to it as far as and I can't help but you could extrapolate it to even broader society and go, as an example, and I don't want to get into dicey areas, but universal basic income.
Sure.
But when people have universal basic income,
then what happens to them socially, right? Does it enable them, or does it have a crippling effect in the long term? And I think there's a lot of research left to be done on that. I think that ultimately there are obvious dangers, but I'm definitely not I haven't analyzed any of the data enough to provide any real commentary on that. But I will say that going back to the research that Gary Allen Fine did was he wanted to look at the idea that that games were corrupting the youth, and what effect those games have on the mind specifically. And so he's like, cool, well, I'm not that type of research necessarily. I'm not a psychologist, but he's like, well, I am a sociologist. And so I can sit on a bunch of game sessions and take notes and interview people and have all kinds of things and kind of record what the impact is over a number of years on people that game frequently. And so I think that for the majority of his research, he was focused on people that gamed on average once a week. So sat down for a game session for D&D or whatever else, any other game system, at least once a week. And he put together a treatise that just goes through, ultimately the wealth of skills that can come out of a gaming experience like that. And he broke it down to your ability to synthesize information, to do quick statistics and mathematics because of all the sort of evaluation that you have to do for dice rolls. Do I want to make that dice roll or this dice roll? Which skill do I want to use? So mathematics, empathy became a huge one. And that's the one that I think is maybe the most related to John B. Calhoun's research is that empathy is it is a skill. I refer to it as a skill because I think it's something that can be learned and that some people do well and that some people do poorly. In the generic sense, empathy is just the idea that we can connect to someone else enough to have access to what they might think or might feel. But in Gary Allen Fine's research, it sort of, I don't know if he went really any further than that, but it definitely highlighted empathy as something that can be learned and that can be learned better or worse. Because if you're playing in a group and let's say you've got the person that's leading the game master or dungeon master, and then you have 2 or 3 other players playing with you, it is a team game. It's the game is creating a compelling story. And so you have to be aware of what compelling means, and that the idea of what compelling is might mean something different to the person that's telling the story, or the person sitting next to you that has a different type of character than you. And when you're 9 and 10 and 12 years old, all you really care about is who gets to slay the dragon, who gets the biggest, coolest sword in the treasure pile, and I think it starts out as something that's kind of inherently competitive. But the more you play, the more you realize that what creates a rewarding, enriching gaming experience, not just for you, but for everybody that's playing with you, is true cooperation. And you can't anticipate what other people need in order to have that really good experience without having a level of empathy that allows you to sort of intuit what they're thinking and what they're feeling, what they're gearing towards. And so it really becomes a group-driven thing. And I think that once you hit your stride with that, if you have a group of people that you play with the most consistently, once you hit your stride where you're all kind of moving together in that direction, that's when games have real impact. I think that for anybody that plays role-playing games growing up and then falls out of it, it's either because they got something else going on in their life that just replaced it entirely, or it's because they never got to that moment where they were getting the most benefit out of it. Because that's what I think links people together, is having empathy and having understanding. And then, like I say, that empathy, that understanding comes with you when you step outside the game. You finish the game and you can still understand those people. You can still read them. You can still feel what they feel. And so let's say you go to school together, which, in my case, that's what we did. We would play and then we'd go to school together. And so you have all these other social experiences together, and you're like, oh, this happened today at school. That might have been hard for him. That might have been really difficult. Or like, oh, this happened, and he might be really excited. And so you can feed off of or make up for the excitements or the disappointments in someone else's life. And then of course that enriches your life, right? And so we talk about games and role-playing games especially as something that, like I say, a lot of Christian groups and religious groups were like really terrified of in the early 80s. And that over time it's proven to have kind of the exact opposite effect, which is to create people that are better at being people. You know, we talk about the rats that forgot how to be rats. Well, if we have a method by which we can teach people how to be better people, and it's a method that they want to engage with. We're not giving anybody homework here to say go home and play 6 hours of fantasy role-playing games. But if it's something that they want to engage with, then they're going to learn skills and they're going to take those skills with them in real life. And I think that that's like a huge boon that would have been impossible to predict. Gary Gygax never thought that. Kevin Sambieta never thought that when they wrote their games. Any of the other great creators that have sat down and penned a role-playing game or any other type of game, I don't think came forward with that level of ambition. I'm going to fix humanity. I'm going to create a game that's just going to like really fix everything for everyone. You know, that's not the point, but it's a serendipitous truth that we ended up there, I think.
One of the other interesting things about your paper was the immersion and the shared construct of the world. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you can elaborate upon that, because, I mean, without that, you wouldn't achieve the fantasy that provides that.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, so, and I talk about that a lot in my thesis in two directions, because the research that I did wasn't just highlighting the possible effects of gaming. It was also relating that to other social constructs that we've had for generations that I feel fulfill that same sort of purpose. And so what I wrote about in my thesis was a sort of a comparison between role-playing games specifically as a game type that encourages and engages people in social behavior and gifts them a skill set if they play well or play with intent. And I compared that to religion, which I think for organized religion specifically, not just like a general sense of spirituality, there's a similar level of kind of mythos embedded in any religion. And I don't say that in a diminutive sense. I'm a religious person, and I just mean that in the broadest general sense that if you're going to learn about, you know, a God that you truly believe in, or you're going to do some research into a pantheon of gods that exist in the world in which you play, those two things aren't the same, but they have a relationship, and that relationship is you're learning in conceptual space. You're learning through a world that you can't visibly see, that you can't tangibly touch. I don't live in a world where I interact with supernatural beings on a daily basis. I don't think any of us do. But the idea that you would have something to learn by reading a book that's 2,000 years old, or you know, maybe a little less old than that, or by reading a role-playing book that just talks about pretend things that pretend to be ancient, you know, that depending on how one or the other is written, you might be able to get a great deal of knowledge out of that sort of thing. And so here's what I'm not doing. I'm not comparing the main D&D player's handbook to the Bible. Not doing that. But what I am saying is that the social construct provided by religious organizations gives you a routine where you meet together once a week, where you engage in social interactions with other people that are operating under the same pretense, which is that God exists, he reveals truth to man, and then men are meant to live in accordance with the rules that God sets for them. And pretense, again, in the non-diminutive sense. It's just a thing that we're willing to accept. And so in my thesis, I talked about the difference or similarity between pretend and believe. And in what way are those two things really logically different? I think that in each case, you accept that something is the case, and you're willing to enact actions and ideas and thoughts and beliefs as though such were the case. I'm gonna act through my life as though God exists, and I guess for most of us, hope that at the end he does. And then, you know, for the function of a game, you act as though you are the character that you are, that you've written or rolled. You act as though you live in a world that bears no resemblance to the world that you actually live in, but you're pretending. And so you go down this line. And so religion, like fantasy role-playing games, whether it's like fantasy or science fiction or anything else, gives you a context through which you can engage with other people, and that maybe you don't have a whole lot in common with those other people except for the game that you're playing, whether that game is a game or a religious interaction. And so that gives you a context through which you can have those social experiences, and you can say, you can theorize, you know, and try to fill gaps and holes in your understanding together, and learn from each other, and sort through abstract ideas together, and like come to sort of, you know, in religion they say coming to a unity of faith, and I'd say the same concept applies to playing games that same way, as you come to the unity that I described when you kind of hit that stride where you're all understanding and feeling together. Like, that's a cool moment. That's a really great moment when you feel the story's progressing the way that you all intend together. And and so the idea that religion or spirituality can be related to gaming, you know, ultimately just kind of wraps back to the idea of, you know, like Carl Jung talked about a collective unconscious, the idea that not this mystical idea of an unconscious that we all mystically have access to, but something that evolved through years and years and years of like thousands and millions of years of human evolution. We have the genetic memory or the instinct that we talk about in reference to the rodent experiments, but that instinct inherently has needs that we need to feel fulfilled. And where do we find fulfillment, or how do we find fulfillment, is a thing that's definitely up for debate, but ultimately social interaction is a huge part of that. And so we create humanity in every eon, in every instance throughout the world, has created context through which to create meaningful social experiences with one another. And so I think that where role-playing games comes from the same sort of inherent instinctual need to connect that drives the development of religious organizations or any other type of organization that fulfills that kind of purpose.
We probably won't include every this part.
Yeah.
But, I mean, all that's good. I'm saying
there's lots to talk.
This next part that I'm going to ask you. So the Preemie, do you think that's like the equivalent of social media selfies? And
man, I could go off, like, we could do a whole second documentary about like the impact of John B. Calhoun's experiments 40, 50 years before the advent of social media. I think so 100%. I think that it's a lot more than that, like besides just like preening in the sense that like you make yourself beautiful, but then it's like it's for yourself more than for anybody else. It's this sort of narcissistic, like, I'm beautiful kind of thing. It's all I know how to do, and then that's all how I spend my time. But I think it's also just like, you know, self-development without a direction or like a goal in mind can often kind of feel that same way. And I say that's like, now we're going like way hypothetical here because I don't know the true implications of what I'm saying. And I definitely haven't overthought any of these ideas, but I think that like, if what you're doing, the end goal or the motivating factor behind it, if it's vanity, you're setting yourself up to get the least amount of impact from that activity. So we talked a little bit already about like role-playing games and how when you're like 10 or 11 or 12, you just want the biggest sword. You just want to be the one that gets the killing blow on the black dragon in the cave, right? And that's what you're about. And because it's vanity. You're excited because what you can do and like what you're going to accomplish. And you know, over time, I think that vanity is cut in half by empathy, because if you can get to the point where you want your friend to exceed your ability, or not necessarily exceed, but if you want them to be as successful as they can be, and you want to help them to be as successful as they can be, then that might sometimes come at the cost of your success, if that's how you're measuring success. You might not get the killing blow on the dragon, but guess what? You might be a wizard that's out of spell points, and he might have the biggest sword. So if you have 3 spell points left and you can cast Fireball, then that might not be as good as using those 3 spell points to like cast a killer spell on his sword that's going to make him do like triple, quadruple damage, right? And so it's like, that's how you have to start thinking about the world, is what can I do to advance us all forward, right? And so coming back to the whole shtick about vanity and like our motivations for engaging in activity, if I'm just like, I'm gonna get up every morning at 6 a.m. and I'm gonna run, that's good. No one's saying that's bad. I'm not the guy that does that, but like that's a good thing to do. You're gonna take care of your body. You're gonna, set yourself up for probably a healthier lifestyle, and you're gonna have a lot of fewer aches and pains, hopefully, when you're 65 than you would otherwise. So all kinds of good reasons to do that. But if the only reason you're doing that is because you want to be like trim and fit and like look a certain way, then ultimately like your mental state is going to reflect that, and you're going to grow in your narcissism through that experience. And it's not going to be about being healthy. And then what if you start overrunning? What if you start overexerting yourself and you start running to an extent that it deteriorates your body because you want so badly to look a certain way? Well, then you've actually impacted your life negatively with something that's meant to be healthful, right? And so, I think that there's an apparent danger in that. And I think that what John B. Calhoun was talking about ultimately, or I don't know if it's what he conceptualized or thought about, but I think that the results of his experiments have that logical conclusion that it's not just the superficial idea that endlessly taking selfies and trying to look good for Instagram is a poor way to spend your life. It's more that the mental state that produces is going to impact every other area of your life. That if that's the only place that you can find meaning is by looking at yourself, then you destroy the opportunity to evaluate the world through another person's lens. And what I'm saying is that I think that's where a lot of meaning really comes from, is trying to learn how other people think and feel, because it allows us to work together and move up as a group. And so, yeah, I think it's tricky, but I think there's an obvious implication for social media. I think there's an obvious implication for like even just the way that we create fixtures of ourselves. That like, I'm not sure how to say that, I guess. That like, when I die, what's left? If it's 400 hours of YouTube videos of me talking about how to perform tasks or learn skills or do anything specific, that might be something that's like an interesting legacy to leave behind. If it's a catalog of music that someone's created, what a gift to the world, or of art, or literature, right? Things that we can contribute that can help elevate the human experience. And like, maybe 90% or 98% of what we put out into the world won't ever be seen by anybody. But if we try really hard and make things as best we can, eventually we're going to find a way to create something that will strike a chord with somebody else and have an impact. And I think that that's what people want to have innately. I think they want to be able to benefit other people. And I think that that's where social media falls short, is that it's trying to be the best that you can be in the most superficial way possible. I want to look the best that I can look. I want to post inspiring quotes that are vaguely, nonsensical sometimes, right? But like, at the end of the day, if what you have left is, you die and you've got like 400 million tweets and like a good number of Instagram selfies, I think you can argue that that's maybe a poor legacy to leave behind, because it can't help anybody. It wasn't for them. It was for you all along. And I think that's, I don't know if John B. Calhoun, I think, is deceased, but I think if he were alive now, he'd be like, man, I was talking about this like 40 years ago. Why didn't nobody listen to me? But
so kind of circling in on that, the popularity of role-playing games in popular culture, and when I think about I'm older than you, and so when I grew up, you spoke of D&D in hushed tones, as I mentioned before, and now it's kind of become popular. Do you see a correlation between the popularity of role-playing games and that need for the immersion and the self-fulfillment through fantasy role-playing games? Like, do you think they're lockstep, or do you think it was just a happenstance of Stranger Things and Harry Potter hit, or both?
That is a hard question to answer. Obviously, there's a correlation. Correlation is not causation, so we don't know that one caused the other. The inevitable downfall of human society has resulted in a generation that's more interested in playing those types of games. We don't know that, or at least I don't know that. Someone might have done the research and they feel like they know that. I think that I do think that it's maybe like a step up above serendipity, though. I think that I guess when I've thought about it most commonly, I think about increased secularization, which has happened at this sort of a similar pace as increase in like digital advancements, right? So, there's a statistic that came out a few years ago about the number of interactions that you have with any other people in a given day. The majority of those interactions is now digital. And at some point in human history, that switched, right? That wasn't always the case. The most social interactions you had were through a device, right? So whether it's through social media or emails or phone calls, most of your interactions at one point were face-to-face. And I think that when I was a kid, and probably when you were a kid, that was probably the case. You probably had a couple of phone calls in the evening on some days, but some days you probably wouldn't use the phone at all. Whereas now, you would be hard-pressed to find somebody in your immediate social group that doesn't do something with their phone or engage with somebody on their phone, whether it's through social media or a phone call or a text, every single day or multiple times a day. I would say in most cases, many, many times a day. But the problem with that is that the nature of those social interactions becomes more and more superficial. And so we're left with, I think a group, like a generation of people that has a different sociality than the one that we grew up with. And I think that the generational differences between, our generation and our parents or our grandparents is, I think we can look at that and say, well, that's pretty profound. My grandparents remember when they got electricity to the farm, and here I am, I remember when I got my first 486 and we had like a 2 megabyte hard drive and thought that was pretty wild. And now, we're launching stuff into space and, having all the billionaires are racing to see who can get to Mars first and whatever else is going on. And so it's like the world has changed a lot, and it's hard to really pinpoint the degree to which those changes are positive or negative, but it's easy to acknowledge the generation growing up now is growing up different than we grew up. And does that give them a greater draw or a greater interest in things like role-playing games or board games or any other type of social game? I don't know that. I don't know that for sure. But there are more use cases. There's more obvious application, because now the research has been done that says, hey, these games can help people. So that's already something that we can say, and we can say with a fair degree of certainty that on average, the average person that's struggling socially, if they play a game like this on a semi-frequent basis for even a few years, that will impact the rest of their life. So now that we can say that, I know a psychologist in Utah, and he doesn't prescribe, but he encourages some of his patients to go and play. Because here's a thing that can help with the struggle that you're having, right? So we already know there's more use cases for it because we can say, hey, this is something that we see can come out of it. But the thing is, what makes it difficult to say yes to that question, is it increased secularization or is it increased digital advancement that's propelling the popularity of gaming forward? I think it's hard to say that, because the other thing that's propelling it forward is now more than ever, there are hundreds and thousands of creators all over the world that are connected through these digital mediums that we're talking about and have all the spare time in the world because they're also not going to church, that they can dedicate their time to that sort of thing. And so that means that we have hundreds and thousands of games that are created, and then the ones that are the best games are more exciting, are more immersive, are more approachable in some cases than games that we had in the 80s and 90s, right? Like, you might have been really interested in fantasy when you were a kid, but if the people that you knew in your high school that played Dungeons and Dragons were too weird, then you might have been just like, oh, well, I just really like Tolkien, or I really like C.S. Lewis, but that's not for me, right? Because there was really only one or two avenues to pursue. But now it's like, well, let's say you don't like fantasy. Let's say you like science fiction. Boom, there's a world for that. There's a game for that. Well, maybe you don't like that. Maybe you like steampunk. Cool, that's fine. We got those. What if you just really love Star Wars? You can do that too, right? So now we have games that can appeal to any specific niche, that can provide varying degrees of complexity to the rule set to appeal to the broadest audience possible. And then we also have generations of the same game that again might appeal to different demographics, right? It's not very many people you find these days playing AD&D, because that was a weird rule set. Like, good job, they did it and it worked, and it propelled everything forward, but so help me, it's an impossible game system to play and to learn. Like, you have to have somebody that knows it to teach it to you. And especially with, like, even before AD&D, with the original, like, Redbox days, like, that was the case. Like, the rules were incomprehensible in the original version of D&D unless you had someone to really explain them. And so a lot of it was making up the game as much as it was making up the story that you were playing. So we've got past that now. They say D&D 5e is like the most streamlined edition of that game, and I agree with that, because they've gone through these iterations of, well, what actually works for people? What do people like about the game? And you have to create something that appeals to, like, the really mathematically minded min-maxers that are trying to, like, figure out the best combination of skills and strategy to, like, take out everything that they run into. And you also have to write something that can appeal to the people who really just like compelling stories and compelling characters. And so you have to create a system that slims everything down into, like, one or two little books, and then some supplemental material, and they'll endlessly come out with supplemental material. But yeah, I think that the biggest impact on why things got popular the way that they has more to do with the wealth of good games available, of well-written good games that have, like, good artwork associated with them, and, like, lots of creative strategy behind them, and better marketing, And then besides that, the other boon to the gaming industry, or part of what drives that, is that you have the generation of people like you and me that grew up in the 70s, 80s, 90s playing these games, that they grew up and they were like, hey, now that I'm in charge, what can I make that's going to contribute to this and make it better and do things? And so I think, role-playing games, maybe more than any other type of gaming, has, like, really evolved, like, trackably over just a few decades. And for it to be a type of game that had its start so late in human history, it's really interesting to be able to look at the back of that now and say, 400 years from now, there's going to be archaeological ancient studies in assuming the world's not burnt to a crisp or flooded by then, there's going to be university classes about the dawn of role-playing gaming. They'll be talking about you and me, and they'll probably pull this documentary up and watch it in class.
And kind of last question is, kind of weird tangent, but I can't help but always think of it, is in today's world, a lot of the demographic, especially in 5e, I've noticed myself, just like being online and stuff, is a lot of, like, queer and transgender individuals, and I think of that as, like, in their circumstances, they probably don't feel like they fit in, and I can't help but go, okay, in the 70s and 80s, maybe it was the nerd that didn't fit in, but now nerdism has kind of become pop culture, but it's like an explosive growth area for them, and then I can't help but draw the connection of social construct of, like, they get to fulfill their fantasies that they might not be able to in real life through role-playing games. And
exactly.
Very similar path, but maybe just later.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's exactly the point, right? Is that you're living through experiences that are different than your real-world experiences. So in the course of a human lifetime, you can live through 4 or 5 or 6 different lifetimes of characters that have completely different attributes than you. And you know, you talk about like the relationship to like queer and transgender people specifically. Obviously, there's an opportunity there for people to create a world in which they can interact with their peers where nobody's looking down on them. Like coming from the background that I grew up in, it's like we talked about fantasy as just something cool and new to explore, and we didn't think about the utility that it served. But now you have like queer and transgender folk that can create worlds that align with just their lived experience and their perspective on the world. And what an opportunity that must be to be able to imagine a world and live through experiences in which you're not ostracized for something that you feel. And like, how tragic is it that that's necessary, but how great is it that there's the avenue for that, right? I think that, you know, I think that about that sort of thing a lot because I have family members that are gamers and that also are part of those demographics. And to think about the impact that must have, it's really hard for me to totally not understand. It's hard for me to contribute anything towards that because I'm a cis white male between the ages of 25 and 36, and you know, and here I am in like the easiest demographic to live, and so I have tried to encourage that, and like I've given my those family members, I've given them like resources and books and dice and all kinds of things to help, you know, get them started. But it's really hard for me to know how best to support that other than just sort of like helping where I can and then stepping away and just watching them do it themselves. Because ultimately it's like it's a world they get to be in charge of when in their real life the rest of the world is kind of trying to be in charge of them and be like, you can't feel that, you can't think that. And that's difficult, man. I don't envy anybody that's in a position like that. But you know, one of the things that I looked at in my thesis was I talked a little bit about actually I guess I looked at it in my research. I'm not sure I really touched on it too much in my thesis, was like suicidality among men. And the rate at which suicidality and suicidal ideation is increasingly common among men of a certain demographic, especially sort of towards middle age, and then compared with women of the same age, like the rates of suicidality are like sometimes triple. That's a scary statistic to know about. But it's one of the things that I feel like in cases like that, it's hard to know all of the components at play in anybody's life that is that level of difficult. But I think that I can say with a reasonable degree of certainty that anybody that's struggling with those types of issues, with those types of mental health issues, can be benefited by an increased level of support from the people around them. If you truly feel that other people love and accept you, that's going to be beneficial. You will still have problems. Life's going to be hard. Life is hard for everybody, but if you have a mental health issue, or if you are part of a demographic that doesn't feel accepted by the majority of the world at large, you're still going to have difficult issues. But if at the end of the day you can look around you and you can see people in your peer group and you can see people in your family and you can feel the level of connection that they have to you, and you can know that they love you and you don't question that, that's going to be a support. That's going to be a real thing. And like, I'm not here to represent the idea that gaming can totally fix that or do that for everybody. But what I am saying is I think that gaming can facilitate that for lots of people. And at the end of the day, I think if you know anyone that has that level of struggle in their life, I don't think that the response is, hey, do you want to come play D&D with me? But it might be. But ultimately, I think that supporting someone does start with the question, do you want to come and do something with me? I'd like to come and do something with you. And you know, games are just the construct by which we engage. That's all they've ever really been. And I do think a little bit about the idea of gaming and role-playing gaming specifically in relation to the the concept of like Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces, right? So we're talking about the hero's journey, and there's a call to adventure, and you want to. That call to adventure might come from any number of sources, but in our real lives, the introduction to or the invitation to come and play with your friends is often our earliest experience with that call to adventure. And to come and play in a mystical realm of fantasy or science fiction or whatever it is this real, you're living your own hero's journey. You're the hero of your story. And we get calls to adventure every day that we either accept or ignore. And they might be real calls to adventure, like real in the sense that they impact your everyday real life, or they might be play calls to adventure where you pretend and you get together with friends and go through, whether it's sports or music or art or games or anything, something that you can do with somebody else. But at the end of the day, it's like where games fit in that is they're just the world in which you operate. They're just the context. The rest of it is you and other people. And here in Canada and North America, we have this really fortunate mentor of having a game store. Not everywhere. It's not everywhere in the world you can go, and you're going to have the same type of game stores as we might have in Calgary, Alberta, going down to the Century Box or going to the Ogre's Den or any of the other number of stores that we have in the city. But when Luke decided he didn't want to farm moisture anymore in the middle of a desert on Tatooine, he couldn't just get out of there. He would have been stuck there for the rest of his life, chilling on a moisture farm, boringest story in the world. But you get an Obi-Wan Kenobi come along and gives him a lightsaber, jumps on a spaceship and moves off into a whole new world of adventure. That's what I think gaming is. That's what I think game stores kind of provide, is that they're not the pinnacle moment of that adventure, but they're the Obi-Wan Kenobi. They're the ones that give us that entrance point into something a little bit more fantastic. And then you walk away with your supernatural gift, which in this case is just a book. That's all it's ever been. It's just a book, and you take it home and you get to play with your friends. And if there's any struggle that you're having in your real life, you can at least get away from it for a little while. It might not fix it, but you can get away from it for a little while. And I think that helps. I think that's important.
I think that's a good way to end it.
Cool, man. Gary, this is fun. I could talk to you just keep asking me questions, man. I'll talk to you all night long.